Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, an infrastructure-led COVID-19 recovery. Today's webinar is an initiative of the Corporate Member Advisory Panel here at the AAA, and today we'll be focusing on current and future infrastructure and building projects that will assist in transforming airports into transportation hubs of the future. For those who don't know me, my name is Sam Layton. I am the Regional Airports Manager and Industry Development Manager here at the AAA. As always, the opportunity to ask questions will be provided, and I'll now show you. Sorry, can I just ask that everybody has themselves on mute? Sorry. Thank you. Sorry, as always, the opportunity to ask questions will also be provided, and as you can see now on your screen is your attendee control panel. You can see in the GoToWebinar control panel and questions chat section. You can click into that section and submit any questions you may have at any time throughout the webinar. All questions will be addressed at the end of each presentation. The agenda for today is available to download in the handout section within your GoToWebinar control panel as well, and along with the rest of today's presentations. Before we commence with today's webinar, I would like to introduce you to James Goodwin, AAA CEO. Thanks, James.
Thanks, Sam, and thanks everyone for the opportunity to be able to speak today. I think this is a great initiative from CMAP to try and get the group together to be able to actually discuss what they are doing, what they can offer the sector. And we often forget that those corporate members that are linked with the aviation sector, they may not make the news stories and the media, but they're doing it just as tough as the airports and the airlines themselves. So great initiative for us to see what's happening in the space and also to look ahead to the recovery phase. Let's try and put 2020 behind us and look towards this infrastructure-led recovery. That's certainly something that the Australian government is keen to do. We could also add job-creating recovery is really what the government is keen to also support. So my update is really not necessarily just a AAA update, but perhaps an update on Canberra and where we're at, where the sector is at, just to provide some context for the discussion that we're going to hear later on in the webinar. So as we know, the sector is doing it particularly tough, passenger numbers down, really considering we're still operating at about 10% capacity for what we were at the same time last year. International numbers are really only the repatriation type flights, so they're still down 98%. So things are doing it tough. Really, it's almost the lowest numbers we've seen since the statistics began. So what's that mean? That to date, the airports have lost about $2.2 billion in revenue, or about $300 million a month. So quite staggering numbers. But what is the path to recovery? Well, in fact, and I urge you to look it up if you haven't seen, but last Friday, National Cabinet released the plan, what they are working towards. And it's just interesting to see that Cabinet has listed aviation as a sector critically at risk because of COVID-19 restrictions. And that's important because it's an acknowledgement that we need to remove those restrictions where it's safe to do so and to be able to manage the COVID situation. And they have put together a plan and a framework. So it's really, some of that is on the screen there, and happy to share that it's, we have a protocol for how to travel safely and in a healthy way, and also aiming to reopen those domestic borders, and certainly by Christmas is what the framework is looking towards. We know that Western Australia at the moment is not signed up to that agreement, but having the rest of the states open without quarantine by Christmas is what the government is aiming to do, and what we want to support them to be able to do. They're also proposing that, certainly reading from their document, quarantine-free international travel with New Zealand and, quote, other low-risk cohorts. So at the moment, we understand that to be next cabs off the rank, Pacific Island countries, perhaps Singapore, perhaps Japan, and perhaps South Korea. So they're the countries to be looking towards next. But in terms of what can we do now during the quiet period, there are some stimulus packages that are there to support airports to be able to get some work done, some capital works perhaps, whilst the period is slow. So there on the screen, we've got the regional airstrip program update. We're waiting for round 2 of the regional airports program. So round 1 has been announced, and there's about 60 airports that have received funding there. A lot of those projects haven't been started yet, so there could be tenders out for those. Round 2, we believe, is imminent. So that will also be very interesting to see what those projects are and what the airports are trying to do, and how particularly the corporate members can assist with that. And we also know things like the security upgrades are also required. Some of those timeframes for implementation, there may be a relaxation of some of those requirements, but it's still all going ahead. The government is not, the government agencies are not stopping proceeding with those things. So look, that's really the update from Canberra. I'm looking forward to the webinar, and hopefully lots of people get things out of it to be able to share their knowledge, and really interested to hear perhaps some of the panel discussion and what comes out of that. So thanks for the opportunity, everybody. Hope you get a lot out of this, and I'll be staying on the line to listen and take any questions if we need. So thanks, Sam.
Thank you so much, James, for that presentation. I would now like to introduce today's MC and host for the webinar, Greg Fordham. Greg is the founder and managing director at Airbiz. He is a sought-after thought leader in airport development, an advisor and facilitator of the conceptual planning and strategies for airports of the future and fast travel initiatives. Greg is a current board member of ACI Asia Pacific and a former chairman of the ACI World Business Partners Advisory Board. In addition, Greg has been recognised as one of Australia's most influential engineers, and this year he received the Medal of the Order of Australia for his service to the aviation industry. Thank you so much for hosting today for us, Greg, and it's so lovely to have you here. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam, and also thanks, James, for the update that you provided. Yes, next month we should have all been getting together at the national conference. So as Sam said earlier, this initiative for the webinar today from the corporate member advisory panel at least allows us, both corporate members and airports, to get together through a medium that sadly we're all far too familiar with. But I have to say, I hate looking at a screen talking with people. I'd much prefer to be talking to people in person. But anyway, I hate it. I'm not good at it, but bear with me for the next hour or so. But we've picked, as James was hinting at, we've picked a great week to have it because I have to say myself and a whole lot of people for the first time for a long time are feeling a bit more positive about aviation, certainly in Australia, with the news of borders opening up, and hopefully our political leaders sticking to what they're saying, that we're going to see a lot more aviation activity in terms of domestic travel between now and Christmas. It's interesting, back in April, Airbiz started producing a report looking at the traffic levels of activity initially in China and their domestic rebound, but then looking at Canada and also New Zealand. And our most recent one, just back at the middle of the month, showed for domestic aviation activity in China being above 110% of pre-COVID levels, which is fantastic. Sure, it's China, but even in New Zealand, despite their second lockdown in Auckland, they're up around the 80% already and still heading north. So that gives us some confidence of what we can achieve in Australia once those borders open up. We've all read and heard the terrible figures associated with our industry and what it's done to our airports. And fair to say that infrastructure development at the airports has certainly been smashed. However, there's always some good stories, and today we're going to hear from a couple of airports that have continued with key developments. To present the first one, I'd like to introduce Dr. Peter Cock, the Chief Executive Officer of Newcastle Airport. And Peter's going to talk to us about the Code E runway project at Newcastle Airport. Peter has a record of driving change and to deliver results with leadership roles across aviation, transport, infrastructure development and professional services. Peter has a strong vision for Newcastle Airport that will deliver some long-term benefits for the region. Over to you, Peter.
No problems. I think I've got to be allowed to share my screen to show you a, not sure that's happening yet.
Should be happening
anyway.
shortly.
Good. So maybe I'll go through some fun facts about Newcastle Airport while that's getting organised. Oh, there you go. So hopefully...
Your screen is now shared, Peter.
Excellent. And hopefully you can see a presentation. Is that right?
We can.
Excellent, brilliant. So for those of you, and so today I'm talking about our asset and one of our projects, but really I want to contextualise it as part of the whole industry. I think it's an interesting story in itself, but I've no doubt it's a story that is repeated multiple times across multiple airports, and so I want to give it as a sort of a parable, but for a broader industry. For those of you who don't know Newcastle Airport, we're located about 170 kilometres north of Sydney on the east coast of Australia. We do about 1.28 million passengers a year, 250 flights a week. That puts us at about the 13th busiest airport in Australia, 13th, 15th, something around that level. Our catchment's interesting. We've got about 1.1 million people in our catchment. So we represent about the 7th largest population centre in Australia, and we're the biggest regional economy. So a lot of economic activity comes out of our region. We have 9 direct routes, 7 airlines. We have international traffic. We have a seasonal Auckland route as well. And so a lot of the disconnect between the size of our traffic and our catchment is because we're so close to Sydney. So we lose a bit of traffic to Sydney, which is a handbrake to an extent on economic development because it reduces the propensity to travel and that filtering. So our role is to grow and serve the needs of the region. We are owned by 2 local governments, but we aren't embedded in council. We are an entirely independent organisation. We have a skills-based board between us and the councils. And in fact, interestingly, we're the largest airport in Australia that's still publicly run. So, and another interesting bit is that we use the runway of RAAF Williamtown, so the RAAF base. So importantly, we're not a joint user airport. The RAAF maintain and operate and do safety, for example, inspections on the runway themselves. So that's the background, and that's our precinct. You can see there, that's our terminal. We've got 28 hectares of leased land and 76 hectares of freehold land adjacent to our site. Which brings me to the project. So the RAAF are doing a maintenance rebuild of their runway. So that's more than just an overlay. It's an actual pretty much full depth rebuild. That's about $115 million. Our runway is currently catering for Code C aircraft. So it's about 3 kilometres long, but only caters for Code C, primarily because of the defence use is for fast jets. RAAF Williamtown, for those of you who don't know, is Australia's premier fast jet base. So the bulk of the F-35s that are in Australia now are based opposite our precinct. So with RAF spending $115 million on us, on their runway, it seemed an obvious time to do upgrades when you're already investing capital. So our project is to talk to the government and RAF about investing an additional $60 million, which would actually allow Code E aircraft to use Williamtown and use the runway. So that requires a bit of additional depth, about 60 centimetres of additional subgrade when they're already digging to depth. So it's a bit more depth to put on. It requires flanks to be put on, which are, as everyone knows, a safety issue, or in case of running wide, and also taxiway upgrades. So there's a lot of benefits. So you get the full access to a Code E runway for civilian use for $60 million. So it's a pretty good value project, but also it's time limited because RAAF have a maintenance requirement which they're carrying on with, and their job starts towards the middle of next year. So at this time we've been promoting and parallel design, but we haven't got the funds committed to actually do the build. And I think in some ways it's a great example of large regional or mid-sized regional airports. So there's a significant regional benefit that's derived from this project, much more than the individual benefit to our business itself. So it's not at the scale we're talking $60 million. It's not a project which we could go finance. However, it produces significant benefit to the region. It's about 200 jobs initially, but in the long term, it produces over approximately 4,500 full-time jobs on an ongoing basis for the region. Interestingly, that's not just about tourism and visitor economy, it also is about freight. So many industries which might not exist will then be able to come into fruition in our region due to the logistics chains established. And the dollars I talk about and the jobs I talk about are incremental. So these are jobs and money and economic value which wouldn't be created, and it's not a displacement from Sydney or Western Sydney. It's new money. It's somewhat unique. It's actually our airfield, as I've noted, is actually the Commonwealth asset. So it's not our asset. It's and it will remain in Commonwealth ownership. So we're not a joint user airport. It's entirely Commonwealth controlled. The Commonwealth benefits financially from our business. They take a percentage of our turnover. So the infrastructure actually pays it back to the Commonwealth over the life of the asset. So it's actually it actually pays back in lease fees, let alone increased taxation. Another unique part about our project is our proximity to a seaport, which is now looking to containerise a road network and a rail network. So that's where that logistics advantage comes from. I guess it's why Code E at Williamtown. I mean, the freight potential, which is what I've already spoken about, is very clear. But where I think it comes into its own is that linkage between high passenger volumes or potential for high passenger volumes above the wing and then freight below the wing. So it's one of those projects that can work and work with airlines to benefit both parts of their business model. A small incremental spend. So in terms of the benefit, if you think about it in relation to the generation of a brand new Code E airport, it's about 1% of what Badgerys Creek spend is. And so you're getting a pretty good bang for buck. The New South Wales government has already invested in a special activation precinct, which is to enhance regional centres and to focus government attention. So that's primarily around defence industries, which again, this runway and this connectivity will help that. And it's important to note that it does improve the functionality for the RAAF. However, it hasn't reached the threshold in their investment program. So not only is it a defence asset or Commonwealth Government asset, it actually benefits the RAAF, but in and of itself, it doesn't reach their investment threshold. Community benefits. So very often you hear at airports about negative community feedback about polling, about noise. But in our case, and I think many regional airports, the region actually gets in behind the airport because they see it as an economic lifeblood. So there's a strong drive in our region to support this infrastructure project. 92% agreeing that the project will produce significant jobs. And in fact, it's a job changer, so a vote changer, pardon me. So there's a lot of people in our region that are very positive towards this project. To an extent, there's a question about, well, why, if it's got all these bells and whistles, why doesn't the airport invest in it? And hopefully I addressed that early on, but again, I think to reiterate, at times with infrastructure assets, there's an economic failure in terms of the entity investing doesn't gain the benefit. So there's the value capture issue. We got Ernst & Young to do some cost benefit ratio modelling, and it produced a cost benefit ratio of more than 2. That was a conservative. Actually, one of the first estimate they came up with was above 10 in terms of the BCR ratio, but that was so unheard of that they thought they can't put that down because no one would believe them. And I think that just shows, as a broader industry, the benefits airports can have, and particularly when it's incremental investment by government in infrastructure on pre-existing assets. So regionally, I think we've got and as a industry, I think we've got a very good story to tell. And as I say, I'm sure ours is just an example of many infrastructure projects in the aviation industry. The project's already at 50% design, so shovel ready for a multi-hundreds of million-dollar project takes a time. If you're going to spend the money properly, you've got to do your design. So we're moving past 50% design now. So in relation to a project of this scale, it is shovel ready. In fact, it's going to happen. So it's going well. Time critical. The federal government through Defence are going to do their build. So if we don't opt in for this Code E element, then the opportunity will be lost, and the need for doing this level of rebuild might come up every 20 to 40 years. So it is critical for our region. So critical, in fact, that we recently wrote a letter to the Prime Minister, and you can see the number of organisations there. And what I think is important, and perhaps the takeaway from this, is there's organisations from the Central Coast, which is just north of Sydney, right up to Armidale. So when you talk about catchments, and particularly for regional airports, catchments are quite large, and the benefit is spread across multiple industries, and particularly the Hunter Business Chamber, the union movement, Hunter Workers, the Minerals Council. So you've got a real, New South Wales mining. So you've got a range of stakeholders which recognise the benefit. To my final slide, I think that as an industry, we've got to tell this story of why it's good to invest in our assets. Hopefully, what I've presented just then is a very compelling story. An asset that's owned by the government, where the revenue generated by the airport pays back the capital investment. So that's a compelling story, and it's tough to get funded. We have to work really hard to raise our voice above the numerous other voices government's hearing. So as an industry, I think we can always need to continue to tell our story. What we will do, we'll apply for funding. We didn't get a line in the budget, which I guess is not unexpected for a project of our scale, but there are numerous funding pools, which I think were brought up earlier in an earlier slide. Very keen to work with all industries, as you can see through the letter we sent to the Prime Minister, but also as an industry to help other airports promote their projects, but also to work to get out with the AAA to get our project promoted. We need a firm commitment, or else the government will just, or the Defence Department will just carry on with their project. And another important thing, I think, in terms of how we're posing this to government is showing a willingness to invest that's commensurate with our ability. It's a tough time for aviation, but we aren't expecting a free ride. We're willing to invest, both in terms of investing within the infrastructure itself, but insofar as we can, due to the economic activity it causes, but also in terms of generating new flights and what that might mean. Governments can invest in infrastructure, but it's a lot harder for them to deal with airlines and invest in route development. So that's our next steps. We're very keen. I think the Q1 commitment is, and prior to that, is very important in terms of where we are in COVID now. There's a real need to provide that confidence to industry. There's people now teetering and making, in the visitor economy particularly, making decisions about whether they'll retain or stay in the industry, or whether it's just might as well shut up shop. There's people looking at hotels, for example, who might want to be making investment decisions. So we need confidence from government to stimulate that investment by the private industry. Thank you, Greg.
Thanks, Peter. And I'm just checking and encourage people to please put in questions during these sessions, because there'll be an opportunity to get them answered. A very interesting project there. But obviously, as you say, you know, in one way your timing couldn't be worse in terms of looking for government support. But you think, as you said, because it's aviation and aviation has been hit hard, that'll enhance your chances of getting a favourable response from government?
Yeah, I think government now, it seems to be the federal government have taken the reins off their spending a bit and are willing to invest in projects which are going to build capacity. I mean, I think we all saw in other government investment programs that of previous, you know, colours that didn't, and it's not a political thing, but in other government investments didn't produce infrastructure which enhanced economic activity. And I think it's hard to go past airports as an economic generator, and particularly in regional economies in terms of that connectivity with industry. So they're long run assets that generate lots of economic activity. So we're hopeful. We're getting the ear of government. We just need to get that commitment.
You also made the point that, you know, a regional airport, but the large one. And it's a lot easier for them to perhaps give out grants to smaller, more rural areas in terms of airports. Will that go against you, your size and how you're structured?
Yeah, it's an interesting or difficult size to be. I think that the programs to support remote and those smaller regional airports is vital, because they just we understand they play such a vital role in those communities. But it's tough. We're not as big as the large airports which have that momentum and scale. Say, for example, starting international services. When you've got an incremental one or two more services or destinations aren't necessarily problematic, but your first one is very difficult. And it's tough, particularly with government programs at the moment where you have to pay for all the infrastructure. And I think a lot needs to be done to see what the energy that large regional centres can do, particularly with our capital cities filling up and and people wanting to diversify where they live. We need to be helped to generate to that scale. So yeah, it is tough. It's a tough but challenging part of the sector.
You also indicated your almost unique model, you know, sitting under local government but independent. Can you and you mentioned you have a board in between local government and the airport. What's the makeup of that board?
So we've got shareholder nominee directors, and then we've got independent directors. So we have the general manager or CEO and mayor of each of our 2 owners, and we also have 5 independent directors. Our chair is Kirby Clark, who's ex-CFO, Deputy CEO of Melbourne Airport, so a very highly skilled-based board. Prior to Newcastle, I was at Perth Airport, and the quality of the material that's produced and the toughness of the questions and the rigour at which the board address us at Newcastle is very similar to Perth. I mean, where you've got super funds, they put in nominees and independents. So it's very much, the feel is very much like any other airport with a board in place.
That's interesting. So you would recommend that sort of model to perhaps other appropriate regional airports? It's something that I know I've been pushing for out of this crisis to get a few reforms. And I think that perhaps for our regional airports, there could be some better models and perhaps some lessons from Newcastle Airport. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. It works for us. I mean, I think the skills-based board is very useful, and the shareholder representatives actually add that a very interesting perspective, and that we wouldn't get otherwise. And I don't know whether we're just happen to be lucky, but we've got some, the 2 mayors, a mayor and a Lord Mayor, are very high quality people who are very used and experienced in working on boards. There's a cost overhead, but I think the governance advantages and the strategic advantages are quite high. We run at a profit. Over the last 4 or 5 years, we've returned about $20 million to shareholders. Of course, not this year, but so yeah, I think it is a really useful model. And I know that often councils will divest to private shareholders, but our board also see us as an economic instrument and a way of generating economic activity, and that they contain more control. They're very, very keen on returns, but they see return in a broader sense than, say, a superannuation fund may do. They see return as a broader economic advantage to the region.
I've also been pushing that out of this crisis, that hopefully we improve the relationship between airports and airlines moving forward, particularly during the recovery phase, and I think there's good hope for that. Perhaps controversially, but would you favour some representative on your board who was there looking at things from an airline perspective, you know, not necessarily a direct airline representative, but at least someone with an airline background who was pushing the perspective of an airline? Would you support that as part of the makeup of your board?
I think it's really important. I think it's important to see clients' perspective. We are providing a service to airlines, and it's important that we see, often airports only see that perspective through perhaps contractual negotiations, and I don't know that they're the right way to do it. We're very lucky. We've got Rob Sharp on as a member of our independent member of our audit and risk committee, and so Rob's just joined, and that we're over the moon. We're very excited when we saw that he'd applied. Ultimately, what benefits our customers benefits us. We have at times a differing commercial views, but that's okay. That commercial tension is fine. But ultimately, I think what the pandemic's shown me is how interconnected our industry is, from the consultants doing design to baggage to food to airports to airlines. We've found the airline engagement really good over recent times. They're really, really stretched, and it's a really tough time for those guys. They're often, you'll find they're doing 3 people's job over 2 days a week rather than 5. So they're hurting as much as us. So anything you can do to increase an understanding of what your customer's life's like, I think is great.
Oh, that's a great story, Peter. We've gone, you know, into an interesting area that perhaps might be a topic for a future webinar, particularly for regional airports towards the end there. But the story you told is absolutely unique. and a great opportunity. And yeah, we all wish you all the success with seeking the funding for a very unique but important project for the region. Well done, and thanks for joining us today, Peter, and sharing your story.
Thanks, Greg.
We're now moving on to the second case study, and I'd like to introduce Travis Callaghan, the Infrastructure General Manager for Queensland Airports Limited. And Travis is going to talk to us about the capital projects currently continuing at Gold Coast Airport. Travis has worked at Queensland Airport since 2014 and is responsible for the planning of airport infrastructure, the management of a portfolio of projects from inception through to delivery. Before joining Quoll, Travis worked for Rio Tinto and was involved in delivery of major infrastructure projects at their Pilbara mines. Over to you, Travis.
Thank you, Greg. I'll just get the prezzo up. Can everybody see that?
Yes, it's showing up.
Yes, okay.
Very clear.
Excellent. Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Greg. So yeah, what I'm going through today is some of the projects that we've been working on at Gold Coast Airport over the last probably, well, 12, 18 months and beyond. So, I mean, I've been working at Gold Coast Airport for nearly 7 years, and during that time, been involved in some pretty interesting and transformational projects. But I suppose when I was pulling together this presentation, there's no more. The projects that we're currently doing and delivering at Gold Coast Airport are game changers. So really exciting times. And I mean, COVID has had a significant impact on the business and obviously, you know, all around the world, but it's really exciting to see these projects take shape in what are pretty uncertain times. So yeah, some exciting things going on at Gold Coast. Bit of a Gold Coast Airport snapshot. So as you're all aware, it's been a tough year, and I think it's been touched on multiple times already. So Gold Coast Airport is about 4.8 million passengers or travel through Gold Coast Airport in FY20, and this was down 25% from prior year. In total, 3.1 million fewer people have travelled in and out of Gold Coast Airport in the past 6 months, and that equates to a pretty scary 97% less than the same period last year. So when I was given that figure, I was amazed. Gold Coast Airport is normally the 6th busiest airport in Australia, with 420 return flights scheduled per week. And I suppose an interesting fact for those who don't know, the airport straddles the Queensland New South Wales border. So I think we're the only airport in Australia that has that. Now, the health and financial crisis came at a particularly challenging time for the company. We're in the middle of a pretty significant capital works program. You know, some of these projects included the Southern Terminal expansion, or I'll refer to that moving forward as the STE, the Airside Processing Zone, or the APZ, at the hotel, Gold Coast Airport Ridges Hotel, and a number of various other airside projects. So I'll spend a little bit of time on most of those projects in a little bit more detail throughout the presentation. But I suppose, obviously, the best time to undertake construction work at any airport would be when there is little operational impact. But with revenue significantly impacted, a measured approach was required. Next slide. So I quite like this aerial image. So this was taken, I think, at the end of October, and it shows, I suppose, the significant amount of work completed at the airport over the past 12 to 18 months. I mean, as you can see, this is the southern end of the terminal. So we've got the Gold Coast Airport Hotel, which is nearly or is complete. we've got the Southern Terminal Expansion STE in yellow. We've got the airside processing zone in the purple, and now that extends along the entire length of the terminal. And we've got the taxiway Echo connection, which is the transitional taxiway between the existing apron and the new apron, and that's in blue. And the RPT apron upgrade, which essentially is the interface between the apron and the STE. So a lot going on. Some of those projects are complete and some are, as you can see, well underway. So been a lot going on in and around that southern precinct of the terminal over the past couple of years. So one of the projects just to talk through was, or is the runway overlay. So as with all businesses, we had to go back and review and reprioritise our capital plan to align with our funding constraints due to COVID. So, you know, we spent a lot of time working through what projects we continued with, deferred, to work out what we should do. But obviously, due to the critical nature of this particular asset and the pavement condition, overlay works on the displaced threshold were approved to proceed by the Qual board in August, and that was a really exciting time, given we were right in the middle of the COVID pandemic. So following a significant amount of planning, Fulton Hogan undertook night works during September. As I said, it was a really exciting time for the team and the business to see these works progress in a very tough time, or during a very tough time. Now, I suppose what COVID allowed us to do here was, or with reduced flight traffic, it allowed the working hours to be extended, which meant the resurfacing works could be completed in 9 shifts, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it was 3 or 4 shifts less than the pre-COVID traffic conditions. So obviously that provided some opportunities, cost savings, and other things. So a few facts on this particular project. The works involved the asphalt resurfacing of 450 metres of the runway and 280 metres of adjoining taxiways, and that totalled about 32,000 square metres of asphalt. The total asphalt placed was 6,500 tonne, and the largest shift production, I think it was on the 4th night, was 962 tonnes. We had a total of 308 asphalt trucks used throughout the works, and again, on the biggest night, we had 47 trucks. Again, for those who have done runway overlays, an enormous amount of people on site. We had approximately 100 crew per shift, and obviously working in with COVID restrictions in terms of all the requirements there, that was new and a challenge that Fulton Hogan delivered well. And it was a total of over 5,000 man hours. And it was approximately a $5 million project, which, given the additional working windows we were able to get, we delivered under budget with no operational or safety incidents. So a really great project, and something that was really timely for the team to get their hands on, and it was really exciting. So I have got a little video on the next slide, which I like to thank our corporate relations team to pulling together. I think it goes for about a minute and just gives a bit of a look at the works. Cool, thank you. And I'd also like to acknowledge our partners on those work. We'll show my screen just a sec. Acknowledge our partners. So Becca completed the design. GHD, the superintendent, and Fulton Hogan Industries was the contractor. And as I said, you know, it was 9 nights of work. We've still got the grooving to be completed, but the work and the planning that goes into these sorts of projects is enormous, and the team did a fantastic job there. Okay, next project. So the Rydges Hotel, or resort themed hotel, is actually now opened. Is on the doorstep of the Gold Coast Airport Terminal. There is no airport hotel in Australia or in the Pacific that has a 25-metre resort style pool, rooftop bar with uninterrupted ocean and runway views, a prime beachside position, and of course the terminal on its doorstep. The hotel comprises of 192 rooms over 7 levels, as well as 2 restaurants, 2 bars, function space, and a top floor gym. The rooftop bar will open to the public and is set to commence trading from mid-October. And the opening of this facility, was a $50 million facility, has seen the creation of over 60 new jobs. This particular project was delivered by experienced hotel developers John Robinson and Nick Paspali of Trepang, and was built by a local Gold Coast contractor, Condev Construction. So yeah, again, a really exciting project that unfortunately timing of its opening in November is not ideal, but is going to be a huge game changer at Gold Coast Airport. The next project, again, I think this particular project, the Southern Terminal Expansion, is the largest and transformational project I think Gold Coast Airport, well, certainly that they're working on at the moment, and I think will be for some time. And I'd just like to introduce Orlando Pullen, who is the project director. I'm hoping Orlando is on the line, and Orlando will be available to take any specific questions on this project and the APZ at the end of the presentation if required. So thank you, Orlando. So what is the Southern Terminal Expansion? So the project involves a 30,000 square metre expansion of the terminal, doubling the floor space of the existing terminal building. It is a 3-level facility with 4 aero bridges and swing gate capacity, which can accommodate international and domestic based on demand. Lendlease is the lead contractor and has been involved in the project since 2018. Work started in I think it was early July 2019, and the building topped out in mid-2020. One of the 2 tower cranes on the site came down just this month in October, and the second will be decommissioned in late November, I believe. The building sustainable design has been a key consideration, with environmentally friendly initiatives including condensate harvesting from air conditioners, energy efficient light fittings, and lighting energy management control systems. The construction of the terminal expansion is a major employment generator for the Gold Coast, delivering 1,500 jobs and with about 200 workers on site during peak times. Now, it's anticipated it will open in 2022, so we're just over 18 months. In about 18 months, we should see this new terminal open. The other project that's currently well underway at Gold Coast Airport is the APZ. So what is the APZ? Airside Processing Zone. It's a 289 metre long, 5.3 metre wide extension along the western facade of the terminal, so the entire apron facade, and it improves passenger queuing and boarding experience. It has flexible facilities, swing capability to accommodate international and domestic departures. These works had the potential to be one of the most operationally intrusive projects the airport has ever undertaken. The location along the front of the terminal with 10 passenger gates, 14 aircraft bays. Building this particular project was always going to be a massive challenge. COVID, fortunately, provided a unique opportunity to deliver the works at a time with low passenger numbers. So the pre-COVID civil works plan included around, or I think, 9 stages. Following COVID and a re-look at it, it's now been reduced to 3 stages. So again, some opportunities in what was a very unfortunate time. The Building Works program is currently sitting at 6 stages, and the team is looking to realise some further benefits there. The works have been broken down into 2 packages. So we've got the civil works package, which is nearly complete or be complete in December, and the building works packages in the final throes have been finalised. So a really interesting project, and the team there are doing a really fantastic job in building the front, or on the apron of the terminal, while maintaining operations, albeit they're minimal at the moment. Still doing a fantastic job to make this project happen. And that's the end of my presentation. As I said, Orlando is available if you've got specific technical questions on the STE or the APZ that he may be able to assist with. But if there's any questions, happy to take them.
Thanks, Travis. And we do have a great question here from the chair of the AAA. Tom, in usual, come up with a good one. Has operating across 2 borders provided any practical challenges to the projects undertaken?
Very good question. Practical challenges. I mean, at the moment, the entry actually to the southern entry, or sorry, to the southern terminal project, to the Lendlease site, actually comes off the New South Wales side. I suppose I'll use a real example. During the runway overlay, we had our border shut, and the checkpoint of the border was essentially right at the entry point to the airport. So one of the items, or the risk items, we worked through with Fulton Hogan was access to the site. Their asphalt plant was Queensland based, so all their trucks had to remain on the Queensland side of the border and come down from the front of the terminal versus around the back on the main highway. Otherwise, they would have had to have crossed the border, permits and the like. So I suppose that's one example. I'm not sure if you've got another one, Orlando, specifically to STE, if there's been any impacts there.
Certainly. Thanks, Travis and Greg. Yeah, there certainly has been pre-COVID, there were a lot of challenges from a planning perspective, and then managing workplace health and safety between the 2 state legislators for the STE project, for the Southern Terminal Expansion project particularly. Certainly during COVID, and with the changing, with the border restrictions, and then the bubble environment for which, contained the regions north and south of the border. It proved a challenge with, we had a lot of subcontracted staff and Lendlease employees coming from outside the bubble, so having to get exemptions to travel into that border bubble. Similarly, with being an international terminal, we're working very closely with the Home Affairs and government agencies, and just getting them onto site during construction to do witness inspections or to have meetings, getting interstate representatives from those agencies from all different states has been quite a challenge. But look, each of those challenges we address. We're obviously, like every other business, we rely heavily on the teams and looking at other tools to try and aid that witnessing inspection process on site through footage or relaying 360-degree images and the like to those that are working remotely, which has some upside too, to reducing travel costs at the same rate.
Thanks, Orlando and Travis. Yeah, just compounding by an order of magnitude the number of issues that have to be dealt with on already complex project. Quite amazing. I have to ask the question, it must have been, to go back to your board and to keep those projects going, you must have had some pretty brilliant boards that papers presented to achieve that. How did you do it? Come on.
It took us a number of months, and obviously well supported by Chris Mills, the CEO, and Marion. Yeah, it was a project that we had deferred the prior year, so it was something we had to do, and we did a lot of work with our consultants, demonstrating that the condition of the asset, we needed to do it. And yeah, I don't know. It was a good board paper. I don't know if it was a good board paper. I think we just demonstrated to the board that it was something that had to happen. It was a good time to do it. We were coming into a wet season. We didn't want to leave it the way it was for another wet season. We'd already done that. So I think it was really important that we did it. And thankfully they supported it, gave it the approval, and we got it done, and we move on now.
And so were your negotiation skills as good with the contractors to negotiate the reductions in their original price as well?
Yeah, Fulton Hogan were really, really good in working with us to they acknowledge that what we put forward at tender in terms of our working windows and requirements obviously changed, and some of them were changing very quickly. So they were very accommodating, and they worked with us to get the best outcome. So yeah, I couldn't fault Fulton Hogan on that one.
Well, we could talk, they're fascinating projects, and we could talk a lot longer, but I'm just conscious of the time and need to keep it moving. But look, you said at the start, Travis, and for you, Orlando, the timing probably wasn't great having all those construction projects. But when you look at it with the terminal, let's all hope that at the opening of that terminal, it'll be perfect timing, because the traffic levels will be up there and well and truly exceeding pre-COVID levels. And wish you all the best. And it's great to see a bit of an uplifting project despite all the issues you've had to deal with. So thanks very much, Travis, on a great presentation, and Orlando for you contributing as well. And good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Orlando. Thanks, Greg.
We're now moving on to the panel session, and I'd like to introduce our 4 panelists who hopefully will come online. I'm a bit worried about one, or whether he's there or not, but anyway, we'll soon find out. Firstly, introduce Floyd de Kruijff, the Technical Director of GHD. Floyd has 20 years worldwide aviation experience, 13 of those on client side with airports, doing infrastructure planning and delivery at airports like Schiphol, Brisbane, Cairns and Mackay. His other 7 years as an aviation consultant, initially with NACO, now with GHD, across Europe, the Middle East, Africa and Australasia. Also, we have Jeremy Caulfield, partner at CPI Australia. Jeremy has more than 28 years professional experience in the finance, consulting, media and aviation sectors. Since 2001, Jeremy has been actively involved in many facets of airport commercial activity, and he has a deep understanding of airport advertising revenue, benchmarking, strategic planning, audience research and segmentation. Welcome, Jeremy. And we have Eric Creel, who is the Aviation Director for Aurecon Australia. Eric manages Aurecon's technical aviation capability across Australia, New Zealand, Asia and the Middle East. Eric has more than 2 decades of experience as an airport development planner and strategist. He's led consultancy teams in Australia, Asia and the Middle East and Africa. Previously, Eric headed airport planning for the Airports Company of South Africa. And fourthly, we have Hans van Pelt, the CEO of Launceston Airport, who obviously jumped out of a board meeting just to be with us. Thank you, Hans. Hans joined Australia Pacific Airports Corporation as the CEO of Launceston Airport in August 2020, and is a member of APEC's senior leadership team. Prior to APEC, Hans led the Tasmanian Government's Aviation and Access Development Unit, and through his previous roles, he brings airline experience, including Executive General Manager of Rex and aviation roles in Asia. So, welcome, the four of you, and thanks for joining us. Just before we start the panel session, we're going to hopefully run a quick poll, because one of the things we're interested in, and in preparing for this we were discussing, is to try and gauge how interested the audience, and hopefully representative of the broader community, in the polls up there. So please, you've got 30 seconds to vote as to, would you currently fly for business related purposes? A quick poll, and we'll see what sort of results we get out of that. Just as a bit of a scene setter for some of the things we're going to discuss moving forward.
See, we're not allowed to influence the decision-making process either, Greg.
No, this is, you can't vote, Floyd, sorry.
Nice try.
Now, have we got any results of that? Yes, so, well, there we go, that's fantastic. 78% saying yes, they jump on a plane for business-related purposes, compared to only 22% saying no. And I suspect if we had said and divided that up between domestic and international, perhaps and said it, related it just to domestic activity in Australia, that might have even been higher. But I guess that reinforces what I said earlier this morning, that we can only look forward, as certainly as our state borders open up, to see domestic aviation really kick off in Australia and grow. The panel's going to discuss 4 main questions that you will have seen in the promotion of this webinar this morning. The first of that is, how will COVID-19 change airports? I'm going to ask Eric initially under that overarching question. Obviously, we're already hit by reduced traffic levels, and so we're starting off from quite a low base. But also, it's not just growing it back, there's also been a hit to passenger confidence. What are your views on the issues of demand, Eric?
Thanks, Greg, and good morning, everybody. We've done some earlier research this year. I also shared that with the association a while back in a webinar. And certainly, we all are very familiar with the quite significant traffic losses that we experience. James also made mention of that again earlier this morning. But if we look at the traffic impacts beyond just the loss, the airports are definitely confronted with a couple of significant aspects of traffic. We definitely foreshadow flight schedule structure disruptions, if not for the medium term, definitely for the short term once traffic recovers. So, for example, there's common acceptance that some of the hub to spoke traffic patterns will start changing. So most likely over this summer, at least in the domestic market, we will see some of our domestic airports seeing much higher activity compared to what the gateway airports may have seen, simply because there's a redistribution of holidaying activity going down. So that's a significant thing that many airports have to respond to. So particularly our smaller airports, I know Hans will be able to speak to that. They may not always have the capacity to deal with that because they may suddenly be dealing with a new charter flight or a new holidaying trip or something that they haven't foreshadowed. So that's definitely something that airports probably will be confronted with for the foreseeable future. The other aspect of traffic disruption is, of course, that this is more true for our gateway and international capital city airports is suddenly they're confronted with huge sets of assets that are lying idle or dormant, underutilized. And the longer this situation is exacerbated, the bigger the challenge becomes. What do you spend your capital on? You know, it's quite amazing that airports still have to spend a huge amount of money even when standing still, and how to prioritize that in a moment of the revenue losses associated, or revenue reductions associated with the loss of traffic. And then something that Jeremy is probably much better to talk to than myself is, of course, the commercial and revenue extraction that just goes along with reduced traffic that airports are experiencing. We anticipate, and that's I'm sure something that the AAA would discuss over the months and years to come, that may also then knock on into the financial, the funding, the pricing type of impacts of how you pay for infrastructure and how you pay for the sustenance of the infrastructure over the next couple of years in a reduced revenue base. So quite a big impact. And I'm glad you mentioned the fact that, you know, switching to the passenger being comfortable in the journey. It was good to see 78% of people still saying on your poll that they would want to make the trip for business purposes. Of course, when you do that for an international trip and for leisure, the figure does look significantly different. And therefore, airports certainly are busy or have to imminently start thinking about very strongly focusing on user-centered approaches to rethink passenger well-being, rethink passenger processing, how they make sure the passengers are not confronted by this new experience once we actually do open the borders. And then, of course, the biggest one probably is the airports are all confronted with having to deal with a myriad of potential future obligations in terms of health management. Too many to mention right here. Of course, it's the world awash with requirements, but the big thing is, of course, that vaccine.
Just on that, Eric, I'm going to come back to you later on that health management one. So we might you know, stop there and come back to that one. Because I'd like to just stick to this at the moment, because I know Hans, who's, you know, suddenly opened up his borders this week and has some very current information on how his airport's changed and what has been imposed upon him at Launceston just to deal with domestic traffic. Hans.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Just before I go to the specifics of that, I think I just want to underline, and I had the Tassie Police and Commissioner here before, who's in charge of our State Command Centre on all of this. And the key message, what I said to him was, we've all got an obligation now to create certainty in the marketplace, you know, so these borders come down and people actually have the confidence to book and can look forward to, you know, whether it's Christmas or a bit of leisure travel over December and January, which is so critical to industries. It's so critical to social and, you know, so critical to connect people. And if you ever wanted a dose of reality at the end of this stuff, or as you're getting towards, you know, light at the end of the tunnel, you want to see the raw emotion that exists in our arrivals terminal when you actually see people reconnecting after this time, because we can talk about all the other stuff. You soon learn what this is really all about. You know, we've just processed a flight downstairs. We're a domestic airport. We're a fabulous airport, but we were never designed to have a border process. And we've just processed one with not one, but two border processes. It was an inbound from Sydney that's got a, effectively everyone goes into quarantine, whether it's government facilities or home. And then because all our Queensland flights, which have opened up this week, are full, there's a number of people that are transiting through, and they're coming, you know, on the ability that they can now fill in their form on a different process, get a QR code, answer a few questions. We had a flight in from Brisbane last night, full, 186. It took us 45 minutes to clear it, you know, through a border process. And as an airport person, as a service operator, you go, you've got to be kidding. But there's a lot of tolerance around. People are expecting it, and then your community is expecting it. You know, the police commissioner said to me before, we need to lock it down again. We've always got the moat. And I said, can we just go back to calling it Bass Strait, and let's not keep talking the stuff around lockdowns and things, because it just doesn't work. And we've got to find a way of learning to live with the stuff. Greg, to answer your question about the airports, there probably isn't a bit that we haven't touched here. You know, we're making some We've got social distancing. We've got, you know, touchless entry exit points into car parks. We've got cleaners following you through all the high density stuff. There's COVID safety officers. You know, we're making sure that we socially distance and adhere to those protocols all the time. We're building a massive marquee for those that know the facility, sort of between our tunnels where you arrive into and our arrivals hall, so we can actually put a temporary facility up, and temporary so that, you know, I could still get it out of here as soon as possible. But to actually make the passenger experience around this border process more friendly. You know, we'll restrict people to coming through past security screening, where all our retail and offers are. You know, just because the numbers get too big, we might even have to, you know, sort of limit some of this meeting and greeting that's going on by keeping the arrivals hall when we get to multiple flights again. The other one that we've really done, you know, without sort of laboring the process too much, but, you know, there's 350 odd people working on the airport precinct here. There's 40 odd companies. I can tell you much deeper, you know, and sadder stories about the Melbourne ones, but we've given an awful lot of rent relief and as much help as we possibly can to get those companies through to the other side, to bring those jobs back, and to not impact our capability. We'll worry about the financial side of that a little bit later, but you know, so far so good. It's just after all this time, it's great to see some borders open. It's great to see some full flights. You know, the Sydney date of 6 November was announced yesterday. We immediately saw Qantas jump on to Lonnie Sydney with an announcement. They put out a press release. They filed some flights. You know, they're committing to a route they haven't been on since 2004, which goes to show what we're working with. And, you know, as part of their press statement, they said that Tassie's got currently 10% of their domestic network going forward based on where the borders are. So, you know, it's the slowly but surely, and then you just keep coming back to confidence and certainty, and we'll do all we can and to make sure that this process works, that the passenger experience is good, but that, you know, whether it's London Airport or Melbourne Airport, we don't become the next Chadstone Mall or whatever the latest outbreak centre was in Victoria.
Thanks, Hans. Moving, it's not only at the airport. Turning to you, Floyd, people have to travel to the airport, and as a consequence, I suspect they're going to make decisions that are a bit different than pre-COVID. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think during COVID period, it's highly likely the use of mass transit. So, you know, people are less inclined to sit on a train or take a bus or things like that. So it's likely that more vehicles more parkers, more in that regard. If you're one or two people close to the airport, maybe a ride share. So it's likely to go up in that regard during the COVID times that are still active until we all feel safe and confident, I guess. But that does provide opportunity for the commercial operator in that regard, for the online travel services, the bookings that are able to be made, the touchless parking, added value to our commercial customer, those kind of things there. But yeah, that's what it looks like.
Yep. And leading in on commercial, obviously, Jeremy, retail commercial is likely to change, and we'll touch on it further down, but just a high level first impact to the change in retail and commercial at airports.
Yeah, I think picking up theme elements of what everyone said there, there's a change not only in the mix of people that are travelling, and as Hans said, people, you know, the VFR is going to bounce back faster than business, which will and leisure. So the nature of the travel journey and the reason that people are travelling impacts what they're going to do in the airport in the first instance. And then you've got the new kind of overlaying psychology of people having different personal situations and experiences and expectations, and so there's less homogeneity in the way that people kind of approach the journey, and that flows on to how they choose to eat and drink, how they choose to shop, whether they choose to eat and drink, and whether they shop. And I think early on, you know, we've had 7 or 8 months now of data out of the airports we work with in Europe and in North America, and a lot of those guys had a bit of a bounce in their summer and a rebound in traffic. And it's probably a pretty interesting insight into how some of the Australian domestic market might respond, and there was quite different changes. It wasn't just that people ate more or less, it's that they ate differently. It wasn't necessarily that people shopped more or less, it was that they shopped differently. And the order in which they did things and the reasons that they did it for changed. And I think that means that whilst the journey, and as Floyd rightly said, lots of people will be coming in a car because governments are telling them not to catch public transport, which means that you kind of spread out the arrivals profile of people into the building. They're still going to have to go through an uncertain process. Once that process is behind them, they're going to be more uncertain than they were before. And that will, the good news is, as I said, we're seeing from elsewhere, people have got short memories. And once there's a level of comfort and I guess a reduced level of stress in the journey, then people do revert to the norm. And if you look at aviation over the last 20 years, there's been plenty of hits and plenty of uncertainty and plenty of changes. And there is a level of reversion once that uncertainty is resolved to previous behaviours. I think there's a probably slightly longer tail this time around due to the nature of the exercise. But yeah, the change is more than just there's fewer people, so they're going to shop less and eat less.
And staying with you, Jeremy, but I want to move on to the next main question, which is what new technologies have been forced upon us because of COVID-19. We've seen cash disappear. That's one thing that clearly has happened this year. But will airport retailers go further and follow the lead of the likes of Amazon Go and totally remove the need to go to a cashier? Do you think we'll see that sort of thing happening in an airport?
Again, there's not a single answer because the nature of each kind of interaction in a commercial space is different. If you're going to order a $20 burger, you want to have a look at that and how it's prepared and whether it's worth something to you. You know, if you think you're getting good value for money, that it'll arrive in the time that you need, you're going to have an interaction that goes from that. If you're ordering a pre-packed sandwich, and you can do that remote from other people and have it delivered to you and touchless payment and everything, that's a completely different exercise. So I think there are going to be technologies that have, you know, I've said a couple of times lately, there's probably some technologies that have been floating around airports for a while that were looking for a home, and COVID's unexpectedly given them a home. And there's probably a few that have been kind of on life support to some extent, and some of those food delivery apps and services are good examples of that, where there'll be an uptick for sure, and we're seeing an uptick elsewhere for sure. But if it's moving from 1% or 2 to 2 or 3 or 4%, it doesn't massively change the needle. The important thing is, for those people who have got high levels of anxiety, it is solving a big problem. And for the people who've got a lower level of anxiety, it's not an issue. So I think the role that technology can play is not necessarily in solving everyone's needs all of the time, but for those most exposed or most apprehensive, it does certainly provide an opportunity for them to distance themselves physically and also, I guess, kind of emotionally, psychologically from the process. So I think there's a bunch of examples that will solve that. Will everyone jump to buying their bottle of whiskey online before they travel? You know, I think that world, there's a whole extra conversation about the nature of the duty-free market and how that's changing. And, you know, there's still some dinosaurs trading the old way, and I think this will expedite some of those things. I think one of the technology areas that probably going to have a little bit more of a hiccup in the next little while is been lots of virtual reality experiences and interactive zones and all sorts of things that retailers are trying to do to increase the level of active engagement. And, you know, if you asked me if I was in an airport to put on a virtual reality set of goggles at the moment that someone else had just been wearing, I'd punch you in the face. So I think there's going to be elements like that again, were probably something that the technology wasn't necessarily solving a problem, it was a point of interest.
And moving to you, Hans, obviously self-service and touchless is going, you know, that was a trend. Moving to self-service was a trend before COVID, but this is going to bring it forward by X years and accelerate it. But at the same time, can airports and airlines afford to invest in that sort of equipment because of what's happened? Any thoughts?
Yeah, it's probably the most important part of that. I mean, with all the uncertainty that still exists, you know, and we're looking at it from an aviation industry perspective, but, you know, I'm one of many who would be loath to gear up now with this current level of uncertainty we're sitting at the beginning of November. None of us really know what corporate travel looks like or what the next actions look like if we have another outbreak or whether the stop-start lockdown stuff carries on. So I'd say a couple of things to you, Greg. One is we'll all be tremendously cautious. We've certainly found some cost savings in our business as a result of COVID that will carry forward going through. We're certainly much more receptive to a changed market environment, self-service, and we've got a few plans here to make some changes around the security screening changes that we have to make, and probably to right-size the terminal to enable those technologies to come in. But it's really a softly approach. And it's probably a stakeholder approach, to be honest, too, because we've been so badly hit. I think down the track, yes. But, for anyone who's looking to come in right now and make presentations on the back of and all the rest of it, it's just the wrong time. We're not ready. We're not looking, come back to certainty, come back to confidence, come back to making sure what we currently do well today. And we'll take a look at tomorrow, in the first half of next year, when we've got a much better idea of where the market's at and where it's going.
But and maybe this is a question to all of you, just a quick one with an answer. Do you think it could open up an opportunity for suppliers to offer to lease equipment, whether it be for self-service equipment or security equipment or the like, and get paid on a per use basis or whatever? Do you think it could open up an opportunity for something like that? Anyone got a view on that, just quickly?
Yeah, I think off the cuff, I'd say you're right. I mean, you started talking to us about cash. So our ATMs are all pretty quiet. There's that whole card, using your phone to buy a coffee and all those sorts of things is fine. I'm not sure that airports or airlines would have much of an appetite on the traditional models around some of this stuff, given the damage that's been done this year. So anything along those lines would certainly be worth a look.
Yeah, and I think to build on that, Greg, to build on what Hans is saying there, it really has to come back to being able to solve a clear and present issue that can't be solved in a more temporary or administratively simple way. So the number of things we're having thrown at us at the moment that say, look, here's an amazing piece of technology, and many of them are trying to solve a problem that is not real or is very short-term in nature, but requiring a big investment. So I think even before it gets to the funding model, is it actually something that's necessary, or is this just, we're all going through tough times and people are just trying to move product? And I think that is going to be a really important determinant of how well people are received when they're trying to sell some products and services. Is you've got to lead with, I understand your business and I understand this is a legitimate issue. I've got something that's a genuine solution, and I've thought about how we can all afford to make that happen.
Yeah, but yeah, that's a good response and leads into what I want to ask Eric. Is we do have a real problem in front of us, and that's called COVID. Eric, are we going to see another layer of biosecurity this time? Terrorism gave us really strict passenger and baggage security. Are we going to see biosecurity and a whole lot of equipment managed by a new airport health department? Is that a real scenario?
Yeah. I think so, yes. But latching on to the very same point that Jeremy and Hans has made, we should not, head over heels into those sorts of things until there's clarity as to what is the new standard and the new protocol for dealing with these things, to get a level of certainty. But to use exactly that analogy, we had in the 70s terrorists putting bombs on aircraft, and we had by the 90s we had a different type of scenario of gel-based threats and such like. And aviation always adapted and adjusted to deal with those levels of threats that it was confronted with. And the key learning from those experiences, and the same can be applied to safety in addition to security, is you never go back. In other words, once you've gone through a certain level of security, the industry does not, sort of dial it back, as it were. So, we're dealing with COVID-19. The last time I checked, it's close to the end of the year 2020. So who's to say there won't be a COVID-27 or a COVID-34, whatever the case may be? So I think the industry and the planet has learned very painfully that these types of things may happen. So we foreshadow the very high probability that there will have to be some level of retained capability that airports may have to end up with once things have stabilized to deal with future. Once these things may happen again, but fully agree with both Jeremy and Hans. We should not, as a consequence of that thinking, lapse into over digitizing and over employing technology and what have you until we've got a good handle on what that might mean, so that we can, as an industry, respond to those sorts of requirements in the future. But yes, I think there will be a future requirement to be able to deal with health risk as another layer in airports.
And another overlay to waiting until we know what we, exactly what we need to deal with. And I think we've finally perhaps got it in terms of security, that instead of imposing a standard, we look at the available technology and build the requirements around the available technology. Do you think we'll do the same here?
Yes, I think it's transient in the sense that we can often find very pragmatic, simple, probably labor-based solutions for many of the things. We know that the government has got to focus on, and rightly so, to say in the first instance, getting out of COVID, let's go for a high employment type of scenario. So I think in this period, once things try to still find its way, settle down, a good practical, pragmatic way might be to just survive and do these things through old-fashioned or simple labor-based things, as opposed to just plunging into a digital abyss or a technology abyss. And I think, Jeremy, you mentioned the world's awash with ideas right now. Which one to choose, which one to apply? It's probably better for us as an industry to settle on a norm or a standard, saying this is how we're going to do it, and then have the conversation about what may be the long-term best technological and operational response. I fully agree.
Yeah, good. And you mentioned pragmatic. I like that, because I think Floyd's got a really pragmatic solution instead of jumping to technology, haven't you, Floyd?
Yeah, no, there's a lot out there. Like you were saying, we've been looking at a number of things, and and a lot of these things in technology were already under development pre-COVID. They've just been accelerated because of COVID, right? So like all this touchless stuff, there's apps that you can now do instead of touching screens. Amadeus is doing that, and you got radar technology that detect heartbeats for security screening things. It's all out there now, which takes care of all these good screening elements and reduces human contact areas, point forward to grasp, do those kind of things. Heat sensors on cameras at a distance, you just walk up and it says left or right. Those things are happening now and are being developed. But one of the best things I heard recently is from Finavia, Helsinki Airport. So they use dogs just for, to build that immediate confidence about COVID detection. And a non-intrusive way is these dogs are able to smell the virus with almost 100% certainty days before it's even lab tested. And they got 12 dogs trained up. And the way it works, you do a little thing of your face, goes in a cup, dog smells it, and he probably barks if you're guilty or something like that. But that's being implemented right now. So those are just practical things and non-intrusive for people with these sniffer dogs that they're potentially accustomed to during international travel.
Brilliant. And I understand also Dubai are doing it. I saw a great clip of the way Dubai are doing it exactly with their airport dogs. As you say, the passengers are familiar with dogs being in airports, and as you point out, I understand the ones that have been trained so far, even people without any symptoms and early stages, they're able to smell it.
Amazing, right? I mean, you don't have to wait all this waiting on testing, and you put the dog there, and there you go.
Yep, let's live in hope.
Greg, can I throw in a word of caution around some of this stuff? I mean, you asked before about, can we do this, and will it be another biosecurity thing, and can we do one system, one approach? You'd have to have your doubts that that's possible right now, given what the states and territories have done here as a classic example. And If it was just about health, it might be easier, but we all know that it's not. I'm also really conscious that we're quickly developing a whole new biosecurity screening technology, business sector and everything else. One of my focuses here, and I'm certainly not the only one, is to make sure that the stuff that's going in right now is temporary, so that it can actually come back out, that it doesn't become, permanent infrastructure and something else that we have to recover across the aviation industry going forward. I think, if industry focused or if suppliers focused on developing something universal and globally accepted for this, because this is a global pandemic last time I checked, that would be really, really helpful before this, and even conversations like this, before this runs away at 100 miles an hour and we're all trying to play catch up with people who aren't expert at this or who have various opinions, which may or may not be politically motivated or electorate motivated or whatever the case might be. Because at the moment we're all over the place, and we're going to be looking at a Christmas where we're all opening up. But I'm pretty sure that, the process into Tassie is different to the process into South Australia, which is different to Queensland, potentially different between Sydney and Melbourne, and who knows with WA.
I think, Hans, if I can add to that, the challenge is like implementing the most appropriate user-centric technology that's, you say temporary, can be pulled away, but if you do it, that it's a building block for the future and not something that's a sunk cost, unless it's an immediate confidence booster, things like that. High return on investment, low cash positions.
Sorry, madam. I mean, people expect to see something now, and there's no doubt that it comes back to building the confidence and building the certainty. But I think, we've all been around long enough to know that this can run away to all sorts of different technologies and all sorts of different solutions without actually first defining what we want this solution to be, either globally across industry, but certainly not across various jurisdictions.
Yeah, you see it running away around Europe.
Just look at a potential impact just for Australia, acknowledging that whether it be for public perception or otherwise, that we have to do some social distancing at is a casualty of that for domestic terminals, only passengers going airside through security, which has been a bit of an anomaly worldwide, but will that be a casualty out of COVID to all of you? What's your thoughts on that?
I think there's two parts to it. There's going to be the people's kind of comfort with the volume of bodies that are being put through and the necessity for people to be in different spaces. And then there's the other, kind of fundamental mathematical issue, which is we're going to get back to a point where the busy hours are approaching what they were before. You can't fit the same number of people in the same space, but spread them out twice as much. So there's going to be a natural kind of consequence at the point where you do get back to historic busy hours, where you simply can't let people through because we're trying to spread them out, not tighten them up. But that point isn't necessarily in the next weeks or months. But I think in the meantime, back to the point about optics and people feeling like someone is doing something practical, that may be something where there is a little bit of demand. As you say, there's no real blueprint to point to because most of the rest of the world look at you in amazement when you tell them that domestic passengers or non-passengers can go through security and wave people off at the gate. So Australia can't really draw on too many experiences from elsewhere for this.
Now, Greg, my perspective on that is ultimately we're dealing with a health scenario, yeah. So we probably should be guided by the health risks of that, and following that logic, it's probably most likely that we may have to look at things like that if that is going to be a contributor to reducing, excessive movement and contact and such like. Particularly that industry is now having a conversation with government. James also made reference to that, the roadmap out of all of this. So that may very well have to be for health reasons, a temporary measure we may have to adopt.
So Hans, you're having to introduce social distancing, and that's easy at first. But as Jeremy says, once we get back to any, think like normal numbers, that's going to get harder and harder. But should the airport be treated any differently to a shopping centre or any other public space?
Well, it probably is under those transport hub rules where, you do have some exemptions and stuff around that. Whether you exercise those morally is a completely different exercise. So you go back to your question about whether you only let passengers through. I mean, for us, and as you get back to where you were before, and as you've got more than a couple of flights leaving at the same time, we'll look at it probably 3 days out from here on in. We'll look at the numbers, we'll look at the times, and we'll make the calls as to when and we do shut passenger screening access to it, to anyone who, well, basically, so you can't do the farewelling. The harder ones actually what happens in arrivals, in particular what we're seeing now. You can easily set your arrivals hall for doors to open only for exit. But you're then starting to play with emotions, and you're going to have to put people on the doors where, if you've got the meters and greeters outside, you then create a whole different set of problems in your forecourts, which you're going to have to manage, all of which is going to take people, all of which increases your risk and your other safety aspects. So I don't have an easy answer on it now. We're certainly working our way through it. To come back to the point that all of that passenger experience safety stuff obviously comes first. But we just don't want to keep throwing people and jobs at this, and still in these uncertain times. So, it's a bit of it's absolutely work in progress. But, screening is probably the easier one. It's the other side of the terminal that where it becomes a whole lot more difficult.
And as you say, this is just handling domestic passengers, because suddenly we've got state borders that were irrelevant, and they're front and centre at the moment. But so going back to you, Eric, and the issue you raised, once we do see international borders opening up, and you touched on it before, but do you think we will see an international standard? There's a whole lot of scenarios out there and being pushed by various stakeholder organisations. Is there any hope for an international standard once international borders open up?
Well, I think it's essential to survival of the industry. Don't want to have a go at my good friend and colleague Floyd, but to use the analogy of the dogs, we've seen a lot of activity in Europe in their summer, which is very similar to the Australian situation, where health is managed at a regional or provincial or state level, and not at a sort of a federation level. So you'll have different standards across different regions. So in this case, Floyd, you will have the Dutch would insist on a Labrador, and you'll fly to Switzerland and they'll insist on a Rottweiler, So, and there's evidence, jokes aside, there's evidence that there was a lot of fights, frankly, within industry, within Europe over the last summer, with having these different standards. So passengers would embark in one airport, going through a certain process, and when they return from the destination, going through a completely different process. And it creates a whole heap of angst. It creates inefficiency operationally, probably incurs cost to industry. So to me, the best analogy would be that we can follow the same process we've been following on the civil aviation side. So in other words, if you've got an ICAO Annex 14 that tells you a runway is 50 meters wide and it's got a center line of this dimension, this color, that is the same everywhere in the world, with a specific purpose, and that is to bring risk down and bring things into repeatable space and a familiar space. And I think ultimately that's what we should, as industry globally, gun for, is to have a single standard way of dealing with these types of things. Then the operators, the airlines, the passengers will all be, it's the point that Hans has made several times, will be in the know, and will have the comfort to make the right business and travel choices around that. So I think it's a critical thing to achieve, probably the most critical, if you ask me.
I would agree.
And then look, it probably opens up a whole area we could spend the rest of the session. So I was probably a bit dangerous, and I'd like to get on and touch on some of the other things. So we might just park that for a sec, because I'm interested, Jeremy, from your side with the changes. Obviously, retail leases are being renegotiated again, around the world to all different ways and means. And you've possibly seen the best and the worst of it. You got a couple of examples of how airports and retailers have worked through this problem?
Yeah, and again, there's no simple answer. So I think some of the reactionary decisions that were made quite early on are really just rusting on problems. So, you know, I've used the example of Atlanta a couple of times. They just extended everyone for 3 years. Well, that 3 years might be half long enough, twice as long. It doesn't solve the issue of the contractual terms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So coming up with a time-based exercise when this is a passenger-based, volume-based issue seems to me to be a bad starting point. Clearly, most airports have dropped their minimum guarantees for the time being, and that's appropriate. But the simple response is that there has to be contracts that deal with the current. There's contracts that deal with the rebuild, and there's contracts that deal with the future. Trying to claw back lost opportunity from one party is problematic, and I think there's a few models as well where people are basically saying, here's a hockey stick, we've been nice to you, Mr. Concessionaire, for the last 6 months, and you're going to pay for that for years to come in some form. So a good example of probably not the right way to go. But I think, again, it's going to come down when people are planning how they relate to their concessionaires. You've got to look at the individual circumstances. We've seen certainly in some of the US airports where they really like a kind of a sports bar. Everyone's sitting quite close together. You sit there for 45, 50 minutes. Those spaces are much more problematic than grab and go food. For a whole bunch of reasons, and mainly around notwithstanding the legislative requirements for people's comfort. So people are eating and drinking different ways, which means that you can't just have a simple approach to all of your contracts for all of your food. People are not picking up books in airports at the moment because they know someone else just picked up that book and it hasn't been wiped down. They're less likely to try on a pair of shoes than they were before. But the travel convenience guys are doing perfectly well. People trying to sell souvenirs at the moment are stuffed. But people who are trying to sell people a new set of headphones or a charger because they forgot it on their travel are doing just fine. So you really need to look on a case-by-case basis. But the principles around continuing to abate the risk to fix payments in the short term is appropriate. We're really counselling people against just extending contracts because it's all been a bit difficult. There's certainly circumstances where this is a convenient way to just end a program that wasn't successful anyway. But trying to put a time tag on this issue and deferring things, kicking it into the long grass isn't the way forward. And the best examples that we're working on and seeing are really about saying, how do we recognise now? Where is there a point where there's sufficient volume and activity for your particular situation to trigger a new arrangement, and how does that evolve? And then, what does the new normal look like? Is it 90% of what we were? Is it 110% of what we were? Whatever else. But a gradual rebuild that is not time-based seems the best way forward at this point.
Better switch my microphone on, that might help. And you've led into the final question, which is, what will the airport of the future beyond 2020 look like? And you've just touched on it already, but just elaborate a bit further. Like, the mix in retail was changing pre-COVID. So this, again, it's another accelerator, COVID, of a change that was starting to happen. So from a retail, polish your crystal ball. What's an airport beyond 2020 going to look like for retail? A quick answer.
Yeah. So very quickly, I mean, Australia is different to the rest of the world. So we'll kind of deal with an Australian context, and then there'll be two parts. There'll be international and domestic. The retail and F&B offer that has provenance and authenticity and localization and all those sorts of elements, and is less substitutable as a result, will always succeed. And that's the way the world's going. I think in the domestic context, we've got very strange shops in our airports in Australia compared to a lot of the rest of the world, because a lot of the units that are there are for convenience. They're the alternative when you're when you've got high volume business traffic. If I want to buy a new business shirt or a new handbag, I can do that at the airport, and it's time that I couldn't spend on something otherwise. The alternative is I have to go to the Westfield on the weekend and lose 3 hours of my life. So there was a convenience proposition that existed. That will remain. The challenge is, in the next year or two, it's likely the business traffic will be compressed, and so the demand for those particular products will be different. So I think really the key outcome is going to be understanding what the composition of the travelling market is and adapting the offer to that. And that means that each airport's going to have a very different proposition. And I think there'll be a less homogenous mix in each airport as a result. And I think the opportunity to remain flexible, and I think the flexibility key is going to be around infrastructure, around processes, as everyone's mentioned. If you don't have a flexible piece of infrastructure that allows you to adapt to uncertainty, you know, again, all the European and North Americans have just been through this. Everything's gone, everything's back on, everything's gone. Quick, what do we do? You've got to have infrastructure that allows you to adapt, and then you've got to have a contractual arrangement that allows you to adapt, because the crystal ball is even cloudier than it was before. So you have to be able to pick the principles that are going to apply, rather than necessarily the picture of what it looks like.
And then moving to you, Hans. Obviously, airports will need to focus, I assume, a bit more on non-aero and developments associated with that. If we're going to see any infrastructure development, you know, it's probably likely something that's going to give a return fairly quickly, which is maybe more likely non-aero. Is that real?
Very. I mean, the devastation and the impact of all of a sudden losing your airplane traffic, you know, across the precinct has just been felt by everyone across the industry. And then you look at the number of pieces of land and the opportunities that you have here. I think there's twofold to it for me. So we've started leading the strategy on it here. There's a number of things that, you know, are sort of being looked at, a number of things that are being followed up on. You know, the airport is a gateway to a region. The region drives destination appeal and reasons to bring people here. You know, you can work with the regions and work to manage up that appeal. But you know, I'll take the case of Launceston. You know, from a Tassie perspective, the public service, Commonwealth and state is largely in Hobart. Lunny's largely commercial. You know, so can you generate some office facility to fix the imbalance, because you then try and manage the impact across an economy? And there are so many different arguments and different scenarios that COVID have brought to light that you can bring into play. You know, do you become an accommodation provider? You know, can you play more in logistics and freight because of all the potential that brings? And all of those things we're now looking at. I mean, Tassie has got a huge reliance, you know, over particularly a summer period on being able to get its high value perishable exports to market on export channels that have been around for years, that all of a sudden this summer are feeling real threats. You know, whereas it isn't just getting it over Bass Strait, it's how do you get it out of the country? You know, what rates do you get it out of the country? You know, how can we possibly help? There are so many different opportunities, and we'll certainly, you know, part of our meeting with the board today was around what we're looking at doing to develop the precinct, which can then integrate it much more with the destination, and you can then bring in hopefully some stakeholders, you know, who can come for the journey with you, and that whole funding component to it may look very different to what it traditionally did. You know, a lot of those plans were in place, but there's no doubt that, you know, new plans are being formed because of the last 6 months. And the fact that you've just got to protect yourself against being that exposed.
Yeah. And staying with you to answer, we've got a couple of questions coming in from the audience, and one that you're probably directed to you. We've touched on it a bit, but it's do like predominantly tourist-based airports have to have a different strategy to a more business-orientated airport? We've touched on it, but any thoughts there?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, you've got to be able to cater for all parts of the market. Tourism's become such a lead component to it here. So, you know, I'm very conscious as we develop our terminal strategies going forward that, you know, Tassie's built a reputation and it's built appeal and desire based on being a premium tourism destination. And like I said at the outset, it's going to be a domestic beneficiary in however big a domestic market we're looking at for a little while. And clearly, we've also got some leveraging opportunities as we bring international traffic back through Melbourne, where we can use the Tassie leg, you know, as part of our own competitive advantage. So the passenger experience around that, the appeal around that, and again, working with, you know, the operators in the industry and the state government around what that looks like, and making sure that experience resonates throughout the terminal. will certainly be something you see here going forward.
Thank you. Another question from the audience, perhaps to you, Eric. And again, we've touched on it a bit, but be a good one to start to finish up and wrap up on. Will the long-term impact of COVID be in terms of airport infrastructure? Will social distancing be something that will be included into the future? Do we make provision for similar outbreaks in the future? So, yeah.
Well, I'm not a prophet, but I doubt whether we will have to, or whether we can sustain with social distancing forever. I think Jeremy made the same point. You know, the mathematics wouldn't allow for that. You know, if you start distancing people like that, you probably wouldn't fit the traffic that you were meant to fit through your facility. So to me, that is a transient thing. It is something that we're doing as a means to survive the current risk. But I do believe there will be a retained capability of sorts that we will have to adopt and adapt as airports to deal with future outbreaks, because this has painfully demonstrated what such a thing as a pandemic can do to an industry. So I think, yes, we will have to foreshadow and be prepared, and possibly more importantly, as an industry, work very actively at crafting that future situation and that future standard of dealing with things. But it will have to change, there's no doubt, in my mind.
I think it will also be, it'll be like a, you know, contract and expand a little bit, depending, because pandemics can still happen in the future. And we got to look at airports or kind of a biosecurity areas, maybe also aerotropolis mindset. We've got now airports that may be office space, non-aero revenues coming in for onto airports are important. So things from a city, offices are less, let's go to an urban feel. So that airport city aspect is probably going to become more and more important for revenue generation for airports too, and maybe a health precinct, things like that, to boost those kind of income streams.
Thanks, Floyd. Well, we're just about right on time, but I've got to ask you all a very quick last question. I want a short, sharp answer, right off the top of the head. 10-second snap. If you had a magic wand, what would you do tomorrow? And I don't want the obvious of have a vaccine or open the borders. Come on. Who's going to kick off? Go, Jeremy. What would you do?
20 years younger and 4 kilos lighter. Obviously, starting point. I'd fix the Middle Eastern transfer experience. I'd fix the US arrivals experience. No, I think one of the things that's come out of all of this, and I agree completely with the concept of uniformity, it's going to be much easier to do that in the Australian market than elsewhere. So if there's a thing I could change, that kind of uniformity to build in flexibility going forward so that there is a level of adaptability is the thing that's going to make the most difference, because something else is going to happen. So I think that would be you wave your wand and everyone remembers forever the need to be building in a flexible approach to the world. Also 20 years younger and 4 kilos lighter.
Eric?
Well, Jeremy stole both my lines there, both in terms of weight and other things. But yes, I have to absolutely echo that. So again, to use Floyd's analogy, if we can choose the right dog here, and absolutely have that single way and standard way, repeatable way, visible way in which we deal with it, I think the industry will be way better off.
Floyd?
Consistency, clarity, I guess, for everybody on the same kind of journey. The digitization I like, consumer choice, and hydrogen and renewable energy across the board. Let's go.
And hands.
It's a strong development here in Balvenie near Launceston. I'll give you two, Greg. One is, if you look at the global environment now, Australia's actually done really well with this stuff, and it's going to come out of this being quite safe. So it'll be good to see a plan to restore the international visitation and the international markets. It is a lot more coherent than, each of us trying to do our own thing by state or by airport or tourism body or whatever, because we'll probably do it a lot less well than what we could if it was actually coordinated, much better than what it's currently looking. And if anything's possible with the magic wand, Collingwood wins the grand final at Your Park in Launceston next year.
Well, on that note, I'd like to thank you, Hans, Eric, Jeremy and Floyd for a very interesting, entertaining and insightful discussion. Hopefully everyone stayed on the line to hear it all. I'd also like to thank Sam and Erin and the team at AAA for something like this to run as smoothly as it has. Takes a lot of effort behind the scenes, and thanks to all of them for giving us this opportunity for the corporate members and the airport members that have joined in and I'm sure enjoyed this session. Thank you, and back to you, Sam.
Thank you so much, Greg, and the rest of the panel. Hans, as a Carlton supporter, I hope your prediction and your wishes never come true. I don't want to see Collingwood win a grand final. But moving on, Greg, thank you so much for the time that you've taken to not only present today, but also all of the preparations that have gone into today's webinar. I'd also like to thank the AAA CMAP group. What a wonderful initiative and a wonderful way to get all of our members together to talk about airports into the future and that transition into transportation hubs. Great topic, and I'm sure the people dialing in got a lot out of it. In addition, I'd like to remind everybody that the AAA virtual conference is going ahead starting from next week on the 4th of November at 11 a.m. A big thank you to our partners, our event partners, including our major event partner, Veritas, as well as our event sponsors, Avdata, Avsec Group, and Collins Aerospace. So as Greg has also said, a big thank you to Erin for all her behind the scenes work putting this together. It is, yeah, it's quite a big job, and she does it well. So thank you so much. Thank you for everybody who dialed in. A copy of this webinar will become available shortly. Please everybody take care, stay safe, and we hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.